Before we start, please be aware this episode explores the topics of bereavement, grief, gender transition, and suicide, which some listeners may find distressing or triggering. Our podcast is created for adult audiences only. We hope you'll join us whenever you're feeling ready and able.
Sky reach 22, clear for takeoff.
Well-being, inclusion, diversity, equality, white skies.
That is a really interesting one.
You just have good days and you have bad days.
We generally want to say and do the right things to engage in a supportive and empathetic way with other people. But why are some topics taboo or harder to talk about? How do we find the right words and the right way? How do we know whether the other person is ready to talk or not? Welcome to Wide Skies. I'm Martin York.
And I'm Debbie Watt.
I'm delighted to introduce you to our guests for this episode. Firstly, Melanie Woolfenden. Mel is an IT professional with a personal insight into the benefits and challenges of gender transition during working life, and the interplay between gender identity, sexual orientation, and religious belief. She has experienced bereavement of close family members and recognises the importance of exploring this sensitive topic in a supportive way. And Mel is joined by Chell de Silva Willis. After a career in teaching and pastoral leadership in schools, Chell is now delivering wellbeing and employability support. She is also a widow who set up an organisation called Elephants and Empathy to support grieving people and train workplaces in how to deal better with grief. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to just start by thinking, why do we find some topics so difficult to talk about?
I guess we don't want to offend people. We've grown up in a society which is very politically correct, and nobody really wants to say something that either is uncomfortable or is going to upset somebody. And let's be honest, we're brought up in a society, especially in the UK and sort of the Western society, that showing emotions can actually be a negative thing. And people get really upset by the fact that someone's just crying and they don't really know how to deal with it.
I would definitely agree with that. And I would also add that I don't think we have very clear rituals about things like grief in our culture. And also I think people do try to avoid feeling uncomfortable. So it's not just about not offending someone else, but also avoiding themselves feeling uncomfortable. And I suppose an absence of language that's appropriate, or a feeling of being ill-equipped with the right language.
I think that language thing is very important, isn't it? People don't know what words to use. How do we know whether the other person wants or doesn't want to be talked to about the difficult subject?
How do you start that conversation about how do you create a safe space for someone to feel that they can talk? We have so many busy lives. I guess it's about being mindful of the people around you and maybe looking for changes in the way they are and asking open questions to allow people that space to try and talk and open up. You can't force people to speak out about things, but if you recognize that maybe there's something wrong, something's not quite right, they're not acting or being the way they normally are, we teach our managers that, how do they know when somebody's struggling, looking for those key signs, and then asking open questions. You can't force people to speak. Maybe they don't want to talk to you, but they want to talk to somebody else, and maybe it's just about creating that safe space and pointing them to the right place.
The signposting. And Chell, do you have anything to add here, any insights for us?
I think I'm going to agree with everything that Mel says. And also I would say it depends on context, where you are when you're with that other person, how many other people are around, what the situation is. In a supermarket, for instance, it might not be the right time to ask probing questions, whereas it might be if you've got someone round for dinner, or again in a workplace or in a break room or something. So I think it does depend on context. And I think sometimes, just to simplify it, and I just simply ask, do you want to talk about this today or now? And that brings me to something else that I talk about quite a lot, is the question, how are you, or are you okay, where people just close the question down. How are you indicates a response of, please say, I'm fine, thanks, or I'm okay. And definitely. The are you okay is another kind of leading question where people feel compelled to say, yeah, I'm fine.
A closed question.
Yeah, So with grieving people and with friends of mine who are in the same situation as me, I tend to say, what have things been like for you today, or what's been happening with you today? So that, and I might say, if you don't have to answer that, it's okay, because sometimes it's too exhausting to answer questions.
One of the things is about also situation you pointed out, Chell, which I think is really important. My partner works a lot with children, and they talk a lot better if they go for a walk or they're doing something at the same time. So they may go for a drive, but because there's no pressure of somebody looking at them in their eye and asking them and then feeling really uncomfortable, it takes that pressure off. And so maybe just taking someone for a walk or going to grab a coffee or something, you're doing something else at the same time, it helps just kind of break that kind of feeling of like, oh, I'm going to be kind of interrogated.
It alleviates some of the intensity, I guess, doesn't it?
Yeah, and they say things that when you're doing motions and you're doing things, that actually it helps you just kind of release some of those, that I guess endorphins and things that actually help you then feel a bit more comfortable about sharing.
There was something else that came to mind, Cheryl, when you were talking. I was sort of reading between the lines and thinking of other aspects to it as well. And I guess when you were saying about sometimes a person's going to want to talk and sometimes they're not, it depends how their day is and, and where they are on their journey as well. And I think context that you emphasise is really important, because when somebody goes through a significant life change, it depends whether it's new to them, whether they've come to terms with it, whether there's something additional that's happening, whether it's the 100th time they've been asked the same question on the same day.
Absolutely. And just to add something, I suppose, of relevance from the weekend, I saw a friend who I've not seen since before Craig died. So for me, that propelled me back to feeling quite raw. And so those conversations were difficult, but I think my friend felt they were necessary. But I had been having quite a good equilibrium, and I would say it kind of upset the balance a little bit. But at the same time, I appreciated that she was open and willing to talk about it and not leave it as the elephant in the room. So sometimes people just can't win. There's a little bit of that too, and I acknowledge that.
And you've mentioned Craig. Would you share your story with us?
Yeah, so Craig was a brilliant guy. He was an endoscopy nurse and a horror author and a metalhead with much longer and more luscious hair than me.
Great combination.
And we lived together, and I had just finished teaching 3 months earlier with a view to doing the sort of career that I'm doing now in employability. And we wanted to spend more quality time together and had loads of things planned. And on the spring equinox in March 2019, he left for work and took ill on the train on his commute and ended up having a heart attack. And I was called to the hospital where I was able to be with him, and he died. So it was a complete obliteration, completely out of the blue, of our lives, his life, and completely unexpected. He was totally fine. He had just launched his 3rd book, and it was, I would say, something that felt like brain damage to me for quite a long time. And I would say I was a ghost of my former self for quite a long time. And it was, I can barely find the words to describe that, to be honest. So yeah, it was very sudden and unexpected.
I can't imagine what it was like, because I've never been in that position, but I just have this image of being hit by a runaway train, the power of the emotion.
Absolutely. It's like you say bye to the love of your life one minute and say, see you tonight, darling, all that. And then the next time you see them, they are having CPR on a hospital bed, surrounded by tons of medical professionals who've told you to say goodbye. So it's something that I would say created PTSD. Yes. And that was just the start of it, I would say. I had no idea what was coming, and so it's quite a triggering story maybe for some people to listen to, because it's harrowing. However I describe it, it's harrowing, and not anything I would wish on my worst enemy.
And yet throughout having experienced this, you decided that you would share your story with other people. Why did you choose to do that?
I actually chose to do this following what happened to my twin sister. She came and lived with me for 7 months. She already lived in Liverpool, which was great. And her workplace were at first supportive and compassionate and empathetic, but they soon lost patience with her. She was very close to Craig. She was looking after me, so she had 2 losses to contend with, because she lost me for that time as well.
Yeah.
And her work suffered a little bit, and she did not receive the compassion and care that would have been so beneficial to her, and she had a nervous breakdown in the workplace and was fired for gross misconduct and had to go through a grievance procedure, which was very traumatic for her on top of what else was going on. And I vowed to help people. Initially it was the workplace thing that was the most important to me, because I vowed that no one else would have to experience that, because the significant loss is not just the partner, the daughter, it goes further than that.
Yeah.
And I wanted to help other people. Widows in my group had also experienced similar things. I live in an area which has a lot of deprivation, and I wanted as well to support communities who couldn't afford to skip the waiting lists by having private counselling and things like that. And I wanted to put something back into my community by doing free workshops for the community. So it's twofold really, but it definitely started with my sister's experience in the workplace, which could have been so different.
I find with clients, the organisations, they could be very rigid in terms of bereavement. Oh, it's only the immediate.
Yeah.
And so sharing responsibilities often, again,
it's defining what is significant loss and who does it constitute. And it's not I think what people think it is, where it's just a very narrow list of parent, grandparent, child, all that kind of thing, which of course are all significant loss, but it needs to be understood that the ramifications of a loss like that, sudden and untimely, could not have been unfelt by my sister in that scenario.
And of course each of us are different and experience things like this in very different ways, don't they? And having the flexibility to accommodate that is really important.
The focus from my experience has been very much compassionate leave, and what I wanted to bring about was compassionate return.
Yes, good point.
Could I ask you, is it still as hard to talk about it now as it was the first time, or does it get less immediate and less painful?
If you ask me that question on a different day, I'll give you a different answer. So yes and no. It depends, but probably mostly veering towards yes.
I was going to say, with your compassionate return, that is exactly it, because it isn't just the 2-week block or whatever when the funeral's done and you go back to work. That's the end of it, because you're still going on that journey, and there's things that will just come blindside you out the blue years later even. And you still need to have that space, and we all need to as humans. We've all experienced loss of some kind. You're very fortunate if you haven't. These things capture us when we're not expecting it, and like you say, it's about having that compassion. Do
you think it's more taboo or difficult to talk about the topic of death or the topic of grief?
That is a really interesting one, and I think if I start by talking about films and TV, I think we're bombarded with death in most dramas, in most films, and I think we are almost socially numbed with death because we're so used to seeing it. And I would say that in our culture we see death and we don't necessarily see what comes after that. And the way, again, going to film and TV, because that's often people's reference points if they haven't experienced it. People see grief as very neatly packaged up. A widow meets someone else and then they're fine, and it doesn't really show the grueling nature of grief. And I think, again, we have words for death, we have language for death, mostly avoidant language like passed away, lost. And then with grief, it's something that I would say, even if people don't intentionally feel it, it's an inconvenience in people's lives. People who want to enjoy a nice drink on a Friday after work, they might not want to have that difficult conversation with their grieving friend. It might upset the balance. And obviously I'm making that sound like people are very selfish, and I don't think people mean to be. Everybody has their own stresses in life. But I'd say definitely grief is more of a taboo, simply because We don't show it in films and TV and the media. We don't really talk about it, and we're afraid to. And I think someone like me, who's had this awful tragedy happen to me, I'm a reminder that it can happen to everybody. And I think the grieving part is more scary than the death part.
People who want to avoid talking about it maybe feel embarrassed, maybe feel guilty, and so there are lots of negative connotations going on, and so you get the classic avoidance that's taking place when somebody may want to talk.
And people are afraid, like Mel said earlier, people are afraid to offend or upset, so they think, okay, I'll just avoid it altogether then.
Yeah.
And so that can inadvertently cause more harm, even though in my rational thoughts now, I understand that. In the real horror of having lost my mind, I didn't understand it, and I felt abandoned and forgotten. And I have actually lost various friendships, partly because I got so angry and lashed out, and some people just haven't ever forgiven me, and partly because some people just simply disappeared.
And Mel, would it be okay if you could share your experience of bereavement with us?
I've lost both my parents. I expected my father to go. He had a lot of problems with diabetes. So you almost anticipate that that's going to be the cause of that death, and you kind of prepare yourself mentally for it, or you try to. And so understanding that my father was the one that was suffering with all of these other health problems, we put a lot of effort into making sure that we tried to tick some of those boxes of things that he wanted to do and everything else. But what happened was we took our focus off my mum. And my mum was so focused on trying to make sure that my dad's health was kept in the best and his spirits were kept up, and dealing with the fact that he'd lost both legs from the diabetes and was in a wheelchair, and all this focus on my father, that she neglected to put a hand out up and make us recognise that actually she was suffering. We knew that she was drinking heavily, and we just assumed that she kind of was struggling with alcoholism. What we didn't know until after she passed was that actually she was riddled with cancer. And she would have been in absolutely massive amounts of pain, but she never spoke about it. She dealt with it alone. I carry a massive amount of guilt for not recognising that with her. I spotted the weekend before she passed away. I was helping her, giving her a bed bath, and found that she got a lump on her breast, and she was like, I don't want to talk about it. I went away and I kind of tried to keep in touch, and the next minute, within days, she was gone, taken away. And it was so quick, and nobody.
So sorry, Mel.
It's a couple of years now, so I've had a chance to deal with it. But you just weren't prepared. You knew that there was some health problems there. We were trying to encourage her to go and get medical help. She wasn't wanting it, but we didn't know at what stage it was. We just assumed it was quite early on that there was this lump on her breast. She'd not mentioned anything about it, and so there was a massive shock for my father that felt so much guilt that he'd been focused so much on his own issues that he'd missed his wife of 30 years suffering, even though he'd live with her every day. That was a huge amount of grief to carry on top of the grief that he was already suffering about losing his partner. Yeah, it was just very, very unexpected, very, very quick. There's never a great time for these things from a work perspective. And one of the things I really liked about my previous employer was the fact that whatever I worked was taken away. I was given the space to focus on my family. It was really, really good from that side of things. I was checking in. I wanted to make sure I had lots of projects on the fly at the time. I was very busy. Yeah. It wasn't the best timing from a business perspective, but it was just taken away from me. It was no, you focus on your family time. You go and do what you need to do for as long as you need and come back. And there was no worries about money. And that is one of the problems that often people deal with, is a kind of worry that, after I can have this much time, but then suddenly I'm going to be unpaid, or I'm going to be short and I've got bills to pay. You don't want that additional stress when you're already dealing with a situation that is very uncomfortable and difficult at the time. Never mind wanting to worry about all of the other things that go along sort of in your own personal life, because that almost stops, but it's got to carry on. The fact that the previous employer made sure that wasn't even an issue was such a blessing. And I've heard so many stories about people that actually they've had to go back to work. They've had to kind of, even when they're not been ready, because they've had to because of finances.
Shout out to your ex-employers then.
Yeah.
Definitely. It sounds like they were really good. But is there anything else you wish they'd been able to do?
So from that perspective, it was great, because they dealt with it at the time. But then when you come back again, as you sort of said, when you return to work, it's as if you've kind of gone back to normal. The pressure's still there. Nobody expects you to still have this weight and this burden. There are flashbacks we talked about. There are times when you just have good days and you have bad days. Work doesn't accommodate for that because they've moved on. And it might be a month down the line or whatever else, and suddenly you just feel tearful all the time.
It might be a year down the line.
Yeah,
It might be
exactly.
an anniversary.
I've lost animals, and animals are really close to you. You know, you spend so much in time in your life, and work doesn't expect that. Nobody treats grief of a pet the same as a child or a person. Yet you can have a bond that is so strong, and it does affect your mental health significantly.
We acknowledge that in our program and our training about pets as well.
But also, you know, sort of miscarriages and things like that as well. There's lots of other things that people don't think about with grief.
Miscarriages, yeah, in particular.
Yeah. You know, when people are going through IVF programs and things and they're trying and that doesn't come through, you know, often companies don't take that into account. And so the grief comes in lots of different ways, not just in loss of a very close loved one or whatever. You know, it could be a friend that you don't see very often. That loss can still affect you quite significantly.
I guess with the workplace thing that Mel was talking about, I recognise hearing things like that from various friends of mine. I think a couple of things to add. One is this misconception that there are 5 or 7 stages of grief by the Kubler-Ross model, which she herself has said was not written for the grieving process. And the fact that it's very messy. You can go through each anger, denial, all of that, even in a minute, never mind on a straight linear line. That just doesn't happen. There's secondary losses that occurs with when there is a death. And it, again, you touched upon it before, the financial thing. It could be your loss of identity. It might be a loss of a home. Like I had to move, couldn't afford to live in our flat anymore. There's a whole host of other things that go along with the death, and also there are loads of different types of losses as well. Even thinking about someone having their home repossessed, whether it's to do with the death or not, that's a huge loss. So it's not just death that I think employers need to think about when it comes to loss. You know, in this day and age as well, with the cost of living increasing, there will be people losing their homes. Some of them will be in work, sadly, and you know, when they go back to work, they will need some adjustments made for them.
And separation, you know, someone is splitting up from a relationship, you know, you might not be the person that was in control of that situation. It's just happened to you, and you go through that process very similarly. You know, the grieving process, it's not a death. It's a death to life as you knew it.
It's all to do with change, isn't it? Managing change. And being in control of it or not.
It's perhaps a slightly overused term, but significant life changes is typically what HR people would refer to, wouldn't they? And I think if you can think in those terms for changes that people are going through, and just think about what the impact is going to be on them. Thinking about what you've accomplished so far with Elephants and Empathy and the talks that you do, how do you think it's helped people so far, and what's your hope for the future?
I'd say we're still baby elephants at the moment, toddlers. So we're at the post-pilot stage, which I do know has helped a lot of people. I would say I was surprised at how amazing the feedback was from people that felt they had a shift. And it's not about getting over a loss or a death. It's about learning to live with it and learning to live around it and growing around it. And I think that was one of the main messages, is we're not telling you to close a door, because grief is love, and you don't want to close the door on grief, and you acknowledge that sometimes you don't almost want to let go of the pain because it can feel like you're losing some connection. So I think that I was really pleased to have the feedback that was one of the most reassuring and comforting things about the workshops, was that we're not telling you how to get over this, we're telling you how we can learn to live around this and with our losses and with our grief in a way that honors the person or people who have died. And in terms of what I hope to achieve, I hope that Elephants and Empathy becomes better known so that more people can access what we offer, and workplaces can improve and have it almost would be taboo for workplaces to not have a grief policy or a back to work bereavement policy, and for workplaces to assume that they have responsibility to learn the language of grief in the same way that they are with mental health awareness, and for it to become as big an issue as that is. And with the community side of things, I hope that I can help as many people as possible for free, so that it's not another cost that needs to be incurred in these already very difficult times. And I hope Craig would be proud of me.
I can't imagine that Craig wouldn't be. And I think it's lovely to hear you talk about giving back to the community, to people who are probably in the most need of what you're going to be providing. Why did you choose the name Elephants and Empathy?
I chose Elephants and Empathy because I was thinking along the lines of animals, and I love elephants, like you, Debbie. I think they're very compassionate animals. They also grieve, and they have rituals. But mostly it came from the elephant in the room, which I think is grief. And there are many elephants in the room, but in this case, it's grief. And the empathy side of thing is just an acknowledgement that we all need to learn to become better listeners, because you can't have true empathy if you don't actively listen. And part of our program, the workplace and the community groups, is doing some activities on how do you actively listen in a way that is supportive and where you just listen rather than trying to fix.
And I think that's a really valuable insight. It's something that we also touch upon on a different episode, where we explore how to be a better ally, and active listening is a really valuable skill as an ally.
Just before the show, you made a really interesting point, and this is a bit of a segue between sections, really. You made a really interesting point about transitioning and grief.
To transition from one gender to another, often family and partners and things talk about the fact that they have to almost grieve the old persona, shall we say, because, you know, if you're in a relationship with a man and they transition to be a woman, although they may have felt like that all of their life and been dealing with that all that time, it's a new experience for that person. You know, when somebody comes out and they want to change gender, or they come out as a different gender to what you thought they were, you've built hopes and dreams up as a family member, as a parent, whatever, for that person. And so you have to change your way of thinking, and to navigate that, they often say that it's like grieving. There is some synergies there. When I've spoken and mentored people, that's the way their partners have almost dealt with it, to carry on that new relationship with that person in their new identity. But
from the outside, I may see transitioning as a rebirth and a very positive thing, but like you say, you have to remember the other people in the relationships, as it were.
I always try and tell people when they come out, they may be at the top of the mountain, and it's a very exhilarating thing that they've made it to the top and they've suddenly been able to share who they are. But the rest of the world is still at the bottom of the mountain. They've got to climb it. You know, they've got to get that journey to catch up with you. I've always known that I was in the wrong body, and I knew exactly what but, you know, for 40 years, I'd been living a lie, effectively. You know, I'd hidden it away from people. And lots of people say, well, I didn't know. And it was like, well, no, that was the whole point. I'd done a really good job of making sure you didn't. I was terrified of the impact of, you know, that information that people see in that side of me. So I did a really good job of hiding it. I used motorcycles and rock music and things to hide my identity. And it was something that allowed me to grow my hair and have some other things, but also to just kind of have this life that people just wouldn't recognize. One of the things that when I transitioned was actually marrying the two, and work was generally really good. And effectively, it was a name change, which is what it is, really. Let's be honest. It's literally a name change.
Could you tell us a bit more about your transition in the workplace?
When I transitioned back in 2005, it really was quite a new thing. I worked for a large organisation with 7,000 people in the UK, and I looked everywhere on the internal systems to try and find out what the company policy was. I knew from a HR perspective that if somebody was uncomfortable about it, that I had, you know, I could go to a tribunal, and they were bound because of equality laws to have to support me. But this fear held me back for about 2 years. I spoke to HR about it, and they didn't really know what to do. They didn't really advise me well. My life was in turmoil, and I went from being a really positive, strong person to being absolutely rock bottom, to the point where the only way I could see out was to take my life. It was a really dark time.
These are thoughts that many people who transition have, aren't they? It's a common theme where the employer is unaware or unsupportive, and it's a topic that doesn't get talked about, doesn't get addressed. And
you just didn't know where to go.
Yeah.
And who to talk to. And it's that there are some similarities there. You know, how do you speak about this? Fortunately, I'd come out to a few people at work that were quite understanding. I actually was really fortunate that actually they stopped me. They taught me out of, sometimes they just recognized that I wasn't reacting the same online in calls and just said, "You okay? Is everything all right?" And one of the times I'd shared, actually, I was just trying to kill myself when you called me, and she stopped me. And it was a real blessing. She's got a special place in my heart because I literally was going to make another attempt, and she called me just at the right time. But it was recognizing that I wasn't responding the same way as normal. I wasn't myself. Asking those kind of questions, say, "Are you okay?" And that was before I'd come out formally. And sort of coming out formally was actually a big release. It was really easy from that point in a lot of ways. I could be myself. People seem to think that the world suddenly, oh, that's great. And they often tell their story about all the things that went up to it. They glamorize, often it feels like glamorizing them. I don't like to glamorize it, that dark spaces. But actually life goes on from after the transition. So that's only the beginning. And there's actually, there's a lot of things that you've got to deal with. You've got to learn to navigate this world as a new persona. And that life isn't as amazing as you think it might be in this dream that you almost make up. You expect everyone's suddenly going to treat you differently because you suddenly present differently, or you feel comfortable in yourself because you've told the world. And not everybody is as supportive and as accepting. I feel similarly when somebody talks about my old persona. It's almost like someone's pulled ice down my back.
Many people who are transitioning will leave their current employer, even though they're perfectly good at their job, because they're concerned about what their experience might be going through their transition. So you end up losing a very valuable member of staff for something that's completely unconnected to their capability and their job role. And the other thing as well is, particularly I guess in smaller organisations, that you may not have an HR department, you may not have a suite of policies, and so thinking about the practicalities of how one might help somebody through transition. I guess the first pointer that I'd like to put on the table is that there are lots of free resources available online that have like gender supportive policies for gender transition and explain what the process might look like, that are freely downloadable. That would be one place I would recommend, and reach out to suppliers, partners, bigger organisations that you work with who may already be doing this for learning. Is there anything else that you'd include, Mel, as perhaps tips for employers on this?
Let the person that's transitioning guide you.
Yeah.
What does their journey look like for them? Because no two journeys are the same. So with our previous employer, they'd been so open about their communications and so open about how supportive they were, that actually we had a person that was coming into work and dressing in their chosen gender and experiencing life as their true self in the office, but then would change back to their previous gender and going home and because they weren't comfortable about coming out socially at home. That comes from the employer just showing having those safe spaces, having that supportive network.
I'd just like to go back to what you said about supporting somebody who could bring clothing in and change at work, because that's a really good example of a very simple change that probably costs nothing, and creating that culture of psychological safety, which is so important for people in minority groups and people when they're going through significant changes.
We had a person that was transitioning, and obviously need to go and buy a new wardrobe, and that can be quite costly. So actually some manager actually and other people donated money to this person that was transitioning to say, we want to support you, and we understand that there's a financial burden with that. So actually what we're going to do is we're going to give you vouchers, whatever, so you can spend that.
That's a beautiful thing at a personal level, isn't it?
Love that.
People typically say, is there anything that I can do? And if there is, just ask. What might your response be to that?
My response firstly would be, it's a kind intention and offer. The second response to that would be, it often doesn't land well. It sounds like a platitude and a promise that can't be delivered necessarily. So I would say, instead of throwing out, if there's anything I can do, just ask, because people won't generally ask. So I would say, with helping someone who is grieving, something good you can do is to say, I can take your bins out on a Tuesday night. Would that help? And give specific ways that you can help. And then say, I'm going to call you once a week and see that you're okay. And it's okay if you don't answer. Or when you message them, always have that caveat, it's okay if you don't reply. I just
Yeah.
want you to know I might ask you a question. It's okay not to answer, but it's to be specific because your brain doesn't work and you can't think, you can't answer questions, you can't prioritize, you can't do anything. It is like having a brain injury. And I hope that's not offensive to anyone who has had a brain injury, but that's the only way I know how to describe it, really.
That's really insightful and thinking about the specifics of how you can help as well. One more question, if I might. How, as a person dealing with a significant life experience, do we signal that we're ready to open up to others?
That's really difficult to answer. I suppose partly by re-emerging. If you're someone like me who completely withdrew, just re-emerging, although when I did re-emerge, it was a year later the lockdown happened. So I just retreated back. I think it's just keeping an eye on your friends and just looking at their body language, their messages, their lack of messages. They're just literally observing and trying to use your gut instinct in terms of whether someone's ready to talk or not. It's really difficult to answer, which is why we always seem to worry about getting it wrong, because even grieving people can't answer that.
You're right. There's almost this thing of trying to drag you out and encourage you to be more social and everything else, and actually you might not be ready for that. I think it's just picking up on cues and, like you say, just being really sensitive to what that person's going through and allowing them that opportunity to talk. Just being open. Like say, understanding your friends, just being there, just like you say, being really intentional, checking in with them, letting them know that you are doing that you're going to do it regularly. And even if they don't respond, because sometimes it's very easy that you're not getting a response, therefore you stop. But actually that might be a lifeline that's lost.
Yeah,
absolutely. And just to add to what you've said, Mel, because I literally have thought everything you've said has been brilliant. Something that Megan Devine, who is my sort of grief hero, really, she has a website called Refuge in Grief. She talks about when people me too each other in a very different context to the hashtag me too, and you need to be very careful, I think, to avoid me tooing someone who is talking about their grief. There is another time for you to talk about your situation, or you might say, well, I've experienced something similar. Do you want me to share my experience? But I experienced this quite a lot when people said, oh, how come I've not seen you around, or, something. And I'd say, my partner died. And then they might go, oh, me too. Oh, my dog died last week. And that's not to say it's less important that someone's dog died, but it's not the right time. What happens is that once the grief topic is in the room, the floodgates open for other people, because they see it as their opportunity to talk about something they never get the chance to. But it's to be mindful that your focus needs to be on that other person in that instance. And even though you might think you're making a connection and empathizing, it often lands really badly. So that's just something to be mindful about, I think.
It's funny that, because we share that in work when we're sharing about people coming out. I know it sounds odd, but you're changing the focus from being about the person to being about your empathy and your experience. So like someone says, oh, I want to share with you, that I'm trans or whatever, and then go, oh, I've got 10 trans friends, and you suddenly make it about you and not about the person that's trying to come out. And like you say, you're trying to share something that's being really vulnerable and trying to share something that's very personal to you, and to keep that focus on you and allowing you that space to talk without taking anything away from you. It's not that your experience, you're coming from a really nice place, but actually shut up.
I think that's a really good point at which to draw this episode to a close. I'm going to stick with Mel saying shut up, because I think that's a perfect end. I realise that this has been quite a deep conversation that we've had about very emotive topics. I thank you both, Chell and Mel, for sharing your experiences and your insights. It's been really enlightening, and thank you very much for joining us on this episode.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And I've enjoyed it, as weird as that sounds. And Mel, it's been really interesting to hear your story and your experiences.
Yeah. And yours too.
Thanks, Mel.
Thank you.
Here's this episode's self-care tip.
White Skies Self-Care.
If, like me, you can spend too much time at your desk, working and building up tension in your body, particularly in your neck and shoulders, this technique may be the perfect antidote. It's called mindful walking. You may be familiar with mindfulness practice where you meditate while seated or lying down. This can be great, but sometimes our minds are too busy and we just want to move. To start off with, identify where you want to walk. It may be in the countryside or in the streets around where you live. I usually plan a route around local fields that I know is going to take me about 10 to 15 minutes, but if you don't have any limits on time, you can be a lot more flexible. I also tend to avoid having to cross busy roads, but if these are part of your walk, you just need to bring your awareness to safety when required. During our walk, we're going to cycle our attention through our senses, what we feel, see, hear and smell. As you start your walk, recognise that this is time for you and set your intention to focus. I often start by focusing on my breath, feeling the air into my nose, into my throat, into my chest, and noticing my stomach inflating and deflating as I breathe in and out. I might do this for several breaths, but you can start where you feel. You may start with what you feel underneath your feet. Is the ground stony? Is it muddy or is it smooth? And what could you sense from the environment? Is the sun warm on your face? Is there a breeze or a biting wind? You may then turn your attention to what you can smell. There may be traffic smells, cooking or farmyard smells. And then what you can hear. It could be birds, it could be building sounds. And then to what we can see. Reflections of puddles or new growth. But it's important that we're not making judgments. It's about purposefully attending to our senses with curiosity. And you may find your mind starts to wander. Random thoughts will pop in. That's okay. Just observe the thoughts and let them go. And then come back to your senses. I usually come back to my breath. And as you come to the end of your walk, it's nice to spend a couple of minutes just reflecting on how you're feeling and what's next in your day. I found this technique just gets better with time.
White Skies Self-Care.
Many thanks to our guests, Chell, Silva, Willis and Melanie Woolfenden, and thank you to you for joining us. We hope you found it helpful.
We very much look forward to catching up with you on our other episodes. And here's a reminder of how you can get in touch and how to access the captioned version of this podcast.
Contact us at linktree/Wide Skies, where you can also find a link to the captioned version of this podcast.
And it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.
Guy reached 2-2. Have a safe onward flight.
Well-being, inclusion, diversity, equality. White Skies, a podcast produced and edited by Majoya Consulting in collaboration with Bridgeborn Psychology.